Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Schwartz with Berkeley Lab. On today's webinar for DOE's Energy Innovator Fellows, we'll discuss planning for electricity load growth in buildings. So first up, we'll hear from Natalie Mims about distribution planning challenges and solutions for growing electricity use in buildings. We'll hear about programs to manage that growth and the value of these programs for future grids where building electricity use is even higher. Then Andy Satchwell will talk about energy and bill impacts of building electrification investments and different kinds of rate designs. Finally, Sean Murphy will cover forecasting building electrification load using publicly available data and applying load forecasts in distribution system planning, as well as integrated resource planning for vertically integrated states. So I think we sent the biographies of folks in advance, but briefly, Natalie is a senior energy researcher and Andy is a staff scientist in Berkeley Lab's Energy Markets and Policy Department. And they also are both deputy department heads. And Sean is an energy policy researcher and assistant leader in the department. So we're going to pause after each speaker for your questions. So please enter your questions at any time in the chat box. You also can unmute yourself and ask your questions live. And if you've got an important clarifying question, feel free to, raise your hand and I'd be happy to have you jump in. So we'll be posting a link to the slides in the chat soon. And we'll also be posting a video recording of today's webinar at that same site shortly. So let's get right to it. Natalie?
Thanks, Lisa. So good afternoon, everybody. As Lisa said, today, Andy and I are going to be talking about load growth from buildings. We can go on to the next slide, Miles. Thank you. I'm going to start off by talking about the impact of load growth from buildings on distribution system planning, and I'll talk about both the challenges and the solutions. And then I'll talk about some efficiency and demand flexibility programs. And after that, I'll hand it over to Andy. We can pause in between Andy and I, but we can also both take questions at the end if we'd like. And as Lisa said, please chime in, put questions in the chat, raise your hand, talk, however you want to interact. We appreciate it. So we can go on to the next slide, which is a poll. And I believe that Miles is going to administer the poll for us. The question is your organization considering the impacts of electricity load growth from buildings, electric vehicles, data centers, crypto, or manufacturing? And you can answer with as many as you'd like. And while we wait for people to chime in with answers, I will comment that although Lisa said I was a senior energy policy researcher, I'm not actually a senior. So just, pointing that out in case anyone was confused.
Hey, I 9 years make you a senior.
I'm teasing. I was just laughing.
I didn't mean in terms of age.
I know. It just made me laugh when you said it. Okay, here's our results. I think everyone can see them. Lots of people, 3/4 of people are their organizations are thinking about load growth in buildings and EVs. About half of people are thinking about data centers, very hot topic. Andy and I, along with some of our colleagues, actually just released a brief on data center tariffs. Less so on crypto, and manufacturing is also up there. Awesome. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So the impacts of building load growth due to electrification is going to be largest in buildings that use natural gas for space and water heating. And the blue portion of these charts represents natural gas space heating in residential and commercial buildings in the United States. And so it's a pretty significant portion of the building stock that has natural gas heating. And as those heating sources switch to electricity, also known as electrification, there's going to be load growth on the electricity system. We can go on to the next slide. States and regions are at different levels of electrification and load growth from buildings, but it can affect all states in the United States. This chart shows residential building energy consumption with electricity consumption by state in purple and non-electric energy consumption by state in green. So for example, Texas is about 30% non-electric, but areas that are already electrified or could be more efficient with new technologies, um, like high efficiency heat pumps. Sorry, areas that are already electrified can be more efficient. So even though Texas has a lot of electric heat on their grid already, they could be more efficient, which I'll talk about in the second portion of my presentation. And then on the other end of the spectrum, New England, states like Vermont, Rhode Island, they have a lot of delivered fuels for heating sources. And so the impact of load growth from buildings due to electrification are going to be a lot more significant. We can go on to the next slide. So the impacts of load growth, are not going to be uniform across the electricity system. There's going to be pockets of it, and they're going to occur at different times of the day and the year, depending on what the load growth is coming from. So for example, on the left side of the slide, this is the number of dwelling units with electric heat in Massachusetts. And this is from an ESIG report that's on building electrification. And this shows where load growth from building electrification would potentially be higher in areas where there is more orange, I believe, or more blue is going to have higher impacts than in areas that are orange. And so it's just not going to be uniform across the state is the point, and it needs more thoughtful planning as we move forward. On the right side of the slide is commercial energy efficiency potential assessment from Pacificor from their 2025 IRP. And it shows different types of buildings that are contributing to load growth. And this is, it's not, load growth is happening in buildings, and it's not just from um, going from delivered fuels or natural gas to electric heating. It's also from different types of load growth. And it also is going to occur at different types of the day, even if it is for heating. So for example, small office buildings are going to have a different saturation of electric space and water heating than a warehouse will. And it also means that the solutions for these challenges are going to be different because the building types are different, the way that people operate in them are going to be different. The usage schedule is different. And so there's lots of opportunities to overcome this, and they're not going to be the same across the board. So we can go on to the next slide. I'm going to talk about a couple of the challenges with incorporating building load growth impacts into distribution system planning. And these are all featured in the ESIG report that is linked at the bottom of this slide. So first, changing weather patterns are hard to plan for. And this is particularly important as we move to electric heat, because heat pumps operate differently in extreme cold, and specifically they operate in a non-linear way. So use of heat pumps during longer and more severe winter events is going to change the shape of demand on the electricity system, and it's going to stress the electricity system in a different way than when more customers are on delivered or natural gas for heating. And the second thing is that electrification is happening, regardless of whether or not it's something that people, policymakers want. It is something that people are choosing to do. And so this chart at the top, on the top left side of it is from RMI, and it shows the sales of heat pumps as compared to gas furnaces from 2023 to April of 2024. And the blue line is heat pump sales, and the orange line is gas furnace sales. And as you can see, heat pumps have been outselling gas furnaces for more than 2 years. And similar to what I said, the impact's not going to be uniform. This graphic on the bottom side of the slide is from Maine, and areas with higher heat pump adoption are going to see impacts sooner. And so Maine has had some policy encouraging electrification, and they've had significant growth in heat pump deployment. They went from 6% of households using heat pumps for heat to more than a quarter of households in 2024. So a lot of growth happening there. We can go on to the next slide. And I'm going to talk about some strategies to overcome those challenges. So we can go on to the next one. Thanks. So the first strategy is improving load forecasting. planners can expand the forecast horizon and broaden the factors that are being considered. So individual electrification projects may be implemented quickly, but the long lifetime of space heating equipment and water heating equipment means that the impacts of the electrification are going to occur over many years. And then when you add in impacts of different weather, such as, if you have people converting from gas heat to electric heat, and at the same time you have, maybe a couple years of mild winters, it might mask the effect of the load growth on the electricity system. And so using load forecasts that capture building electrification really should look beyond 3 to 10 years, which is typically what's being considered in distribution system planning. So moving beyond that shorter time frame in distribution system planning could be important. And it also means another factor is looking beyond recent trends to develop the forecast. And this figure on the right side of the slide shows how historical trends and known projects make up the majority of the inputs into short-term forecasts. But physics-based modeling, which simulates how power demand would change given changes to the energy-related characteristics of individual buildings, and the adoption forecasts make up a larger percentage of the input factors in forecasting as we look further into the future. After we lengthen the forecast horizon, planners can also consider how buildings are used to establish a better baseline. Having information on the types of buildings at a granular enough level to inform planning and to understand the variability and electrification across the distribution system. This was something that I mentioned earlier, small commercial is going to operate differently than warehouses, and understanding what your building types are and how they're using electricity is going to be important for understanding the impacts of load growth from building and electrification. And then planners can also consider the impact of weather in more depth, especially as building energy consumption is going to become more weather dependent. And then finally, forecasters can deepen their understanding of building energy consumption and consider multiple forecasts or scenarios to capture some of the uncertainty of technology adoption, weather, and location, and ultimately improve their forecasts. An example of that is shown in this italicized text down at the bottom of the slide. In Minnesota, the PUC found that Excel's load and distributed energy resource, or DER, forecasts can be improved to enhance accuracy and expand the types of results generated. And the commission required Excel to submit a C&I beneficial electrification forecast to help capture some of the changes in electricity demand that are occurring in that sector. We can go on to the next slide. I apologize for my distraction. I have a new dog who only acts very badly when I'm doing meetings. Okay, so another strategy is to modernize planning approaches. So planners can reconsider some core planning assumptions, such as design conditions, like how hot or how cold it's going to be outside. You can think about thresholds, for example, how much loading a feeder the utility is comfortable with. We can consider headroom, such as understanding what an appropriate planning margin is. And then also load diversity, meaning not all load is going to show up at the same time in the same day. And in addition, planners can move beyond a single peak hour and gain a better understanding of what distribution system impacts are. And this doesn't have to be automatically going to an 8760. It could just be adding representative or considering extreme days. And I'll talk about these last two bullets if we go on to my next slide. So planners can consider how to improve reliability and resilience metrics in distribution system planning, such as how we are measuring success given changing risk, and if there's other metrics we should be considering. So for example, how do we consider the impact of outages on distribution system reliability from a quality of service and human health impact? So as an example, in distribution reliability metrics, major event days are excluded, and that's what's shown over here on the right side of the slide. They're removed from trends so that planners can understand trends year over year and they don't overreact to any single summer or winter event. But the counter argument to this is that the risk posed from load growth from building electrification could create longer duration winter events that create health and safety impacts. So on the right side of the slide, it shows the system average interruption duration index minutes per year of outages. And in the blue, that includes major event days, and it's without major event days in orange. And similarly, the bottom chart shows the system average interruption frequency index. And so if, there's a pretty significant difference in the number of minutes, and if those are happening during a winter storm, it could have a very big impact on human health. The chart on the left side is from Rocky Mountain Institute, or RMI. They look at different types of houses in a prolonged winter outage event to understand how long it takes for houses built in 1950 to get really uncomfortable, and it's just a few hours. But you can make it, a day or two if you get into a more modern stock, because they can maintain indoor temperature for a longer period of time. We can go on to the next slide, please. So an example of rethinking metrics like this is from Consolidated Edison, which is in New York, a utility in New York, their benefit cost analysis handbook, which they file as part of their distribution system implementation plan. And the current version includes 2 reliability or resilience benefits. And the first is the net avoided restoration costs, which accounts for the avoided cost of restoring power during outages. And then the net avoided outage costs, which accounts for customer outage costs due to reduction in frequency and duration of outages. And we can go on to the next slide. My last point on modernizing the planning approach is sharing information across the natural gas and electric utilities. We have a relatively new report. It came out in December from Regulatory Assistance Project and Berkeley Lab. And in it, we identify characteristics of integrated electric gas distribution planning. And we have indicators and benefits associated with that. And we go through several different indicators and benefits in the report. But this chart is an example of one of the characteristics of an integrated electric and gas planning process, which is aligning inputs for forecasting and planning. And it can produce multiple benefits, which we show here in this graphic, such as lowering costs, increasing reliability, and improving the confidence of regulators and stakeholders in utility investment decisions. We can go on to the next slide, please. This is an example from Massachusetts. The regulator there required the electric utilities to participate in the electric utilities to participate in planning with the gas utilities. And I believe this is still the first required regulatory requirement where the commission has told the electric utility that they need to plan with a gas utility that is not, part of the actual company. So where it's not an electric gas utility. And those plans are going to be due in the spring of this year. So if we go on to the next slide, I'm going to wrap up my presentation talking about strategies to reduce the impacts of load growth from buildings and electrification on the distribution system. So we can go to the next one. States can start off by promoting efficient electrification. This is an analysis that Sean Murphy, who you'll hear from in a couple speakers, he led this analysis, and we did it for Fort Collins Utilities in Colorado. And we found that efficient electrification reduces summer and winter peak on a representative residential feeder. So the green line here is the load forecast without electrification, and the blue line is the less efficient electrification, and the orange line is efficient electrification. So you can see the benefits there. We can go on to the next slide, please. States can encourage utilities to design efficiency programs that reduce peak demand. This is an example of some research from the lab we called our cost of saving electricity and cost of saving peak demand. And this is a cost curve that shows programs from our database, and these are from 2012 to 2018 or so. The residential and commercial programs are producing significant peak demand savings, Residential is in the teal color, commercial industrial is in the green color. And you can see the dollars per kW that the savings, the peak demand savings cost, and the width of the bar represents how much of those savings are available from the portfolio. So these are reported demand reductions from energy efficiency programs alone. And we found that most of the programs are reducing peak demand for less than $200 a kW. We can go on to the next slide. So one example of reducing peak demand with energy efficiency is from Excel, and this is in Minnesota. They piloted a geo-targeted program where they were aiming to defer a $4.1 million capacity upgrade for a transformer feeder and feeder configuration, and they needed to do it within 5 years. And they ran the pilot for 1 year, and they the bar charts on the right side of the slide show how the efficiency measures and load control programs, so there was demand responsiveness as well, were planned and then used to achieve the savings. And the program ultimately overperformed and created 575 kW of peak demand savings, the majority of it coming from commercial lighting and smart thermostats, but it also did include some residential lighting and smart thermostats as well. You can go on to the next slide. Another opportunity for states is to encourage demand flexibility in buildings with financial incentives to customers. This is also some work from Sean, who you'll hear from. This is a report that he put out last year. And in it, we identified demand flexibility incentive structures and levels by program types. So there's several types of incentives that utilities or aggregators can offer customers to encourage demand flexibility. So you could do an upfront incentive to drive technology adoption and program enrollment. That's what's shown in this chart on the left. You can also do retention incentives that are encouraging continued enrollment. That's what the chart on the left is. And then you can also have performance incentives that are promoting energy and demand reduction. Also shown in the chart on the, actually it should be on the right side, sorry, I apologize. For Wi-Fi thermostat programs, which are a very common program across the United States, they generally have both upfront and retention incentives. And the upfront incentives that are being offered are typically around $100 per enrolled device. And so there's lots of opportunities to develop these programs and build on lessons learned from other utilities already. We can go on to the next slide, please. States can also encourage utilities to promote demand flexibility using innovative customer outreach options. And this is an example from Portland General Electric, which is in Oregon. And they explored what motivated their customers to participate in their demand flexibility pilot. And they found that bill savings was a significant motivator, as was reliability and resilience. So there was a variety of different motivations for customers to participate. I'm going to skip the next slide in the interest of time and go on to my slide about targeted electrification. Awesome. So another thing that states can consider is targeted electrification, which can reduce the cost of building load growth on the distribution system. So the targeted electrification strategically decommissions portions of the natural gas system at a specific geographic location. And there's lots of states several states who are promoting this. And there's several examples on this slide that are from California, in Albany, which is in the Bay Area, and then there's also Monterey is trying out a pilot. PG&E has done over 100 different targeted electrification projects. There's also some examples from Colorado. They have a manufactured home targeted electrification project that is in its first year of winter operation right now. And then also in Massachusetts, the regulators are requiring the local gas distribution companies to deploy targeted electrification pilots, and those proposals have to be filed by next year. And then in addition, there's 8 states that have enacted legislation that promote thermal energy networks, which are neighborhood scale shared network of water pipes that can transfer heating in and out of buildings. We can go on to the next slide. And I believe this is my last one, so I'll pause and see if there's questions after this, and then I will hand it over to Andy. But states can also promote front-of-the-meter efficiency, such as conservation voltage reduction and volt-VAR optimization. They're commonly referred to together as voltage optimization. And it can reduce significant amounts of demand on the electricity system. And utilities have access to tools to estimate how much they could save from voltage optimization. One of the examples I think I have on the slide is from Ameren, which is a utility in Illinois. They had an EM&V and evaluation, measurement, and verification report about using voltage optimization, and they found that they saved almost 87 gigawatt hours and more than 13 megawatts of peak demand in 2022 with this program. So it can create really, really significant savings. And then the table on the right side of the slide shows examples of the equipment that can be used for voltage support and reactive power. So I will stop there and see if anyone has any questions. And if not, I will pass it over to Andy.
Okay.
Okay.
Hi. I was just going to say, you can enter your questions at any time in the chat box or raise your hand and ask your question live. Miles, I was talking with Miles about a question. I was curious about the slide 11 on the resilience and reliability metrics, which is a topic that Miles and I have been working on. We just released a report on that topic, and you put a link to the chat box. We also have a request to show your dog. So first of all, we should do that. It is the cutest dog. Little naughty, but like 5.5
He
months
is
old.
laying down and being like so calm and chill now that I'm done
Maybe
presenting,
later.
but he ate a plant and ate the trash while I was presenting. So I apologize for my distractions, but I'm gonna show him because I love doing it.
It's a big dog. It's like, look at that.
His
So
name is Ziggy.
it is a retriever. What are the combos?
He's a retriever pit bull mix, and he's 5 months old and kind of a pain. But anyway, I apologize for all of my distractions.
Yeah, Ziggy Stardust, truly a star. So anyway, my question, less exciting, but my question about this slide was, just trying to drive home the connection with the topic at hand, which is how do we better plan for electrification of buildings, and how improving reliability and resilience metrics helps with that, just to make it a little bit plainer. And we have Miles on standby here to opine as well.
Well, I did have a few thoughts on, Berkeley Lab has a ICE calculator tool that measures customer interruption costs using a collection of customer interruption cost surveys, and it will be interesting to see as we do an update of the tool with new survey data what the impacts to the cost of customer interruptions are as more electrification occurs, and they may have larger impacts on customers, whether customers are reporting in those surveys that interruptions, or they're willing to pay more to avoid an interruption, and thus investments in resilience to extreme weather may actually grow higher and higher, and we may be more willing to do that.
And I think the point of this slide was that as we switch to electric heat, when there are reliability or resilience issues, there is a potential for more risk for humans if they're in buildings that are heated with electricity and the power goes out, particularly in these longer duration storms. And so the current way that we measure reliability, which is what I was trying to illustrate on the right side of this slide, is around SAIDI and SAIFI, and we are excluding major event days. And so it's a question that, like, should we be thinking about other ways to be measuring reliability and resilience to capture this risk that customers could be exposed to?
Miles, you want
So I don't know, Lisa, if that was better.
No, that's
Yeah.
really super helpful. And Miles, you could comment on that too. Other metrics that are used by utilities to capture that better.
Yeah, the metrics that tend to focus on those events specifically, the major event day, the major events and the major event days. So you see metrics that have a more customer focus, that instead of being an average that includes the event days, if you're looking specifically at those major storms, the customers experiencing multiple interruptions or customers experiencing long interruption durations, over those specific events, you get a sense of how long that tail is to the right for customers that are experiencing the really long interruption durations, and that are the most affected. And to be able to get a sense of how fast the restoration times are, and how long that tail actually is, apart from just the averages.
And then in response to the question in the chat, I do not know off the top of my head what the analysis is, but this link where it says source RMI takes you to the actual analysis. And I believe it does have all of their assumptions and methodology for how they did this. For the question for Oregon, the incentives that were offered, Lisa, do you remember what the smart grid testbed incentives were? I think it was like
Very
$1.
high. It was, well, it depends. So first of all, there's a huge suite of programs, right? So I'm not sure which specific incentive. What's
So
what
for the
was that,
smart grid,
Natalie?
it's the slide about the different ways that they looked at what motivated consumers. And so you
Mhm.
remember the smart grid testbed had like
Yeah.
$1, I don't know,
It was
per
very high.
KW or something.
Yeah.
And I don't
KW.
have it listed on the slide, but it was based, they were offering customers this incentive and then also offering them other options for how they could use their savings. They could donate it to a charity. They asked a lot of questions about what motivated people to participate and what they wanted to do with the savings that they were acquiring. And it was in geographic locations that were part of more or less a non-wires alternative project. And so let me see if I answered the question.
Three substations, with,
Mhm.
different composition of customers. And this was truly a pilot where, they were actually accruing savings to put off any potential expensive upgrades on a substation. At the same time, like Natalie said, I mean, they're also trying to understand for the future, what's the motivating factor? Is it money? Is it, helping the community? Is it reducing reliability issues? So it's a really interesting pilot, but it was a very high per kilowatt hour number for savings. I can put a link in the chat later to a better resource for that. Anything else before we go to Andy? All right. Thanks, everybody. Andy.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and hi everybody. Nice to have an opportunity to speak with you all. I'm going to pick up a little bit of where Natalie left off and talk more specifically about the value of efficiency and demand flexibility in future grids with load growth, especially in the building sector. And then I'll kind of tie a little bit of that into a discussion about how some of that value flows into customer bills and talk about rate design specifically around building technology electrification. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to kind of take a step back. Actually, let's go to that was a previous slide. We can go to, I think we're going backwards. There we go. I'm going to take a step back, but slides are going to move forward. And I want to talk a little bit about the bulk power system for a moment, because I think this is a good launching point when we start to put numbers to this value and of efficiency and demand flexibility. So this comes from a study that we did a little over a year ago, looking at the costs to the bulk power system. So this is new generation and transmission capacity, fuel and variable operations and maintenance expenses on the grid. And what are those costs in futures with varying levels of load growth from the building sector, and particularly through electrification technology? So as a starting place, we found that very inefficient electrification. So think of, electric resistant space and water heating added a pretty significant load to the grid. And as a result, the modeling showed we needed to build a lot of new generation supply, requiring high capital costs and transmission investment costs. A lot of this too is just thinking about like, well, what does that grid of the future look like, especially with this inefficient electrification? And it's a lot of switching from summer to winter peaking as you convert, building end uses from fossil fuels to electricity. And then those summer peaks also shift later in the day because you're electrifying loads like water heating and cooking that tends to occur in people's homes, residential homes, later in the day as well. And so you can see here on the right, I mean, it's pretty staggering, right? That we found that between 2030 and 2050, depending on the sort of speed at which you also decarbonize the power sector through renewable energy supply, you could be sort of kind of almost more than doubling and getting close to almost tripling the costs on the grid under inefficient electrification. So as a starting place, that's an important note. So if you go to the next slide, we can see just on a load growth basis as well, a lot of this is really expected to occur, not only this bulk power system, but if you dive in, it has really important locational impacts. So this is some work a colleague of ours, Margaret Pigman, is leading. The Building Technologies Office is developing what they're calling building standard scenarios. These are data sets of residential and commercial building end use under different future load growth scenarios. And this one in particular looks at fairly high deployment of electrified heating through heat pumps and much more limited, like baseboards, kind of electric resistance, mostly heat pumps. So even heat pumps, what you see here is a pretty significant change in load depending on what county in the US you're at. So this data set is down to the county level. The percentage change that's being shown here is change in annual just heating consumption. So anything green is showing a reduction in heating consumption. So that's through heat pumps being a more efficient use, whereas the sort of brown darker color is an increase in demand at the county level through heat pumps. And this is showing places where there's a lot of conversion from fossil-based heating to electric-based heating through heat pumps and more limited electric resistance. So these impacts are going to be quite significant as you drill down on a locational basis. So go to the next slide. So, well, what's the role of efficiency and flexibility? Well, going back to that study at the bulk power system, kind of two, I think, examples highlight the opportunities here to use efficiency and flexibility to help kind of mitigate some of those impacts that I was talking about. So the first example I think is a good one is Texas. This is modeled in 2050. We're looking at a summer peak day, right? A summer peaking system. And what we find is that using heat pumps, which themselves have a higher energy conversion rate and are thus more energy efficient than electric resistance heating and cooling options, can just sort of reduce generally the peak impacts from this new demand load growth compared to that inefficient electrification. So we sort of shift that curve down, right, in the summer. In the Northwest is an example of where you have under inefficient electrification, again, a lot of electric resistance heating and water heating, you get pretty significant peaks in the winter. And what happens is that you can reduce that peak and quite significantly through heat pump deployment as well as demand flexibility. So things like, thermostat control programs that reduce set point temperatures, and also other strategies just like shifting, broader loads in the residential home. So you can actually affect these peaks simply through using more efficient heat pumps as well as implementing demand flexibility strategies. We'll go to the next slide. And so what does this mean on a dollar basis? Well, going back to those pretty staggering increases in bulk power system costs, when you assume more efficient heat pump deployment and greater demand flexibility, you can reduce these fixed and variable power system costs by a pretty significant amount. And sort of the most aggressive deployment of renewable supply with the most sort of kind of aggressive deployment of inefficient electrification building technologies, you can reduce almost a third of those costs, about a little bit over $100 billion a year, just simply through efficiency and demand flexibility. And this is particularly true for power systems that have more aggressive load growth and state goals related to renewable and clean energy sources, because those are so capital cost intensive. If we go to the next slide, we can actually see that on a very specific kind of locational basis. We looked at those sort of avoided costs or savings from efficiency and demand flexibility by grid region. So you could think of these as sort of kind of the control areas or the kind of balancing authorities that manage large regional parts of the electricity system in the US. You know, across the board, they all saw you know, avoided cost savings, but in particular, it was pronounced in systems with winter peak capacity needs. And then also that furthest one on the right, the $122 per megawatt hour, that was that's sort of New York City, like within New York City, right? And it's as you could imagine, a very heavily constrained transmission system, and so it has an inability to rely on sort of the lower cost potentially resources outside of that kind of New York City focused area. And so actually efficiency and flexibility in that particular case had really high value because it just reduced the need to rely on that more expensive generation within the New York City grid area. So I think what you can take away from these results is that, you know, winter peaks are particularly important when we talk about load growth in the building sector from really, you know, electrification. And also to think about the value of efficiency and flexibility as well in systems that are pretty constrained, that can't sort of transport electricity and share across large areas. So there's a significant opportunity there as well. So we'll go to the next slide. This is going to kind of transition us now into thinking about, well, how. So we looked at these kind of impacts from the bulk power system, but what does this look like for customers, right? And what are the energy and bill impacts of building electrification investments? And then thinking through, well, you know, what are some ways potentially to design alternative retail electricity rates to reflect that value and potentially mitigate some possible bill impacts? So we'll go to the next slide. So this is a study we did and published it just, I think, within the last like kind of half year or so. And what we wanted to look at was, well, how does heat pump deployment change customer energy and change customer energy bills, so energy consumption and energy bills. And we looked at buildings across 4 different regions of the US to try and get a sense for to what extent do, you know, climate factors and underlying building stock, as well as just differences in energy pricing sort of affect these outcomes. So on the left, pretty clear that electrification, so we modeled, you know, pretty full heat pump deployment, as well as electrifying cooking and water heating for homes that were eligible for that and had those end uses. So converting from fossil fuel to electric. Interestingly, just on an energy basis, so energy consumption, it reduced, you know, electrification reduced building energy consumption across all 4 regions we looked at. And you can see actually the distribution of all the homes that we modeled, in some cases close to 10,000 simulated buildings per each of these locations. So full distribution, every customer home we modeled across all the regions, energy savings across the board. However, and this is what is, I think, both interesting but really important to think about, is that when you look at the energy bills, in some cases, customers' bills increased, and in other cases, customer bills decreased or increased. And this was really due to the differential between the cost that customers pay for fossil fuels, so natural gas prices, versus electricity prices. And in many parts of the country, that differential is quite significant, where electricity costs more per unit of energy than fossil-based resources. So even if your energy consumption is going down, more of your consumption is now based on electricity, and the cost for electricity is much higher than those fossil fuel alternatives. And so your bill can actually go up. So this is kind of the launching point to think about, how do we, possibly mitigate these bill impacts and think about it through retail electricity rates. So go to the next slide. We wanted to get a better handle on, okay, so for customers that either their electricity and energy bills increase or decrease, what are those characteristics of those customers? And can we say anything about who stands to win or lose under these different scenarios? So we segmented out the customers depending on what their baseline technology was. So what were they starting with before they installed building electrification technologies? And what we found was that one of the strongest determinants of whether customers have energy bill increases or energy bill decreases is if they start with some sort of an electric resistance technology, or if they start with some sort of a fossil fuel or non-electric baseline technology. So it's a little bit of an eye chart here, a lot of results to show in one figure. But under the green, we can see the distribution of customer bills for those that converted electric resistance heaters, so like baseboard heaters, to a heat pump, or converted electric resistance water heaters to a heat pump water heater. In that case, you get you're already starting with electricity consumption and you're getting pure efficiency gains because heat pumps are just so much more efficient than its electric resistance counterpart. On the right, we see a large distribution of the customers seeing bill increases. So, and those are customers that started with some sort of a fossil-based technology. So they had like a natural gas furnace, or they had some sort of like a natural gas water heater, for example, and that converted over to a heat pump. Even though their energy consumption would go down, they are paying more because of that price differential between electricity and the fossil fuel prices. And so this is a sort of a way to think about segmenting customers in a way that's quite predictive based on what technology they're starting with, and then when they convert and adopt an electrification technology. So go to the next slide. So the natural question after this is, well, what can we do with retail electricity rate design to try and mitigate some of those impacts, especially for those customers that start with a fossil-based technology? So one approach that's of interest and is being explored by some utilities and states right now is shifting revenue collection from volumetric to fixed charges. So customer bills are composed of a monthly customer fee as well as charges for volumetric consumption. If you think of it as that's the total pie of the customer's bill, you could sort of change how that pie is divided up and then change the size of those individual pieces. So if you collect more from a customer through the monthly customer charge, you actually lower the volumetric energy rate, all else being equal, just to collect the same amount of revenue. And so some utilities are exploring this, increasing the monthly fixed charge for customers and therefore reducing the volumetric energy rate. And this can mitigate the impacts of this increased electricity demand from heat pumps or other building electrification or just electrification technologies like EVs, because that consumption that's sort of shows up as you adopt the electrification technology is being charged at a lower rate than it would otherwise. This example here I'm showing is from Pacific Gas and Electric, which serves a large number of customers in California, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they offer this all-home electric home rate. You're eligible if you have at least one kind of building electrification technology. And you can see that the rate includes this $15 per month service charge, which is higher than if you're not on this rate and just under the regular residential rate. And it reduces that volumetric rate. They also have it structured, as you can see in the bottom right, for a lower rate in the winter season. So particularly for customers who switch from like a natural gas furnace to heating from a heat pump, this can be, quite beneficial. It's important to note that as you reduce that volumetric energy rate, you may have some unintended consequences of mitigating incentives for customers to invest in energy efficiency or distributed solar PV that tend to rely on savings from the volumetric side of the bill. We'll go to the next slide. So, do these actually work as intended? Well, on the left, going back to that study I was talking about and have shown some results for, where we segmented out customer energy savings and customer bills, we actually looked at a case where we said, all right, let's increase fixed charges for customers and see how that affects outcomes. What we did was we assumed the utility would collect the same amount of revenue, but that just more of that would come from the fixed charge and less from the volumetric energy consumption. Well, what we saw was across the board for the full distribution of customers, as you increase the proportion of the bill that comes from the fixed charge, you really affect the bill outcome and you move more of those customers above the line in this graph, which is towards more bill savings, especially for customers who had a fossil-based baseline technology. And it reduces some of the extreme outcomes as well. But again, there's a counter maybe consequence where it would mute some of the savings that customers had for energy efficiency. Another option here is time varying rates, and you can see an example on the right. So instead necessarily of increasing that fixed charge and lowering the volumetric energy rate, can you actually change the time of day charge such that you charge more during certain hours of the day and less during others to try and get customers to shift out of the peak? PG&E, again, this utility in the San Francisco Bay Area, offers both that all-electric home rate I was talking about on the previous slide, but also a time of use rate for customers. And this is one data point, I should be clear, and actually the data point is my home in the Berkeley area. We have a home, we installed heat pumps. We actually have two separate heat pumps because we have two separate floors of the house that need separate units. And I would say we have kind of moderate building efficiency. And this is my bill over the last, I think it's actually over a 13-month period. And you can see that it varies depending on which rate. And so I'm currently under a tiered rate plan, but they compared it to the two other options that I would have. Don't do as I do. And here I'm paying more. Somebody who's in the industry is actually not paying close enough attention apparently. But I'm paying the most among my options. I could certainly save on these other rates. And at least in this one data point, the time of use rate provides the largest reduction in my bill compared to that all home electric rate. Again, this is just one data point, but I think it raises this question of maybe time varying rates or other rate designs may achieve the same intent as increasing the fixed charge, but still preserve some of those incentives to shed load or to shift load or to pursue energy efficiency. I still haven't switched rates. I've seen this information. I still haven't made the switch, but maybe after today, this is a good motivation. We'll go to the next slide. So we'll stop here and just kind of take a poll. I think I am kind of curious, both based on what I've presented here, but also just your all's experience. What do you think among these different rate design strategies would be the most likely to balance these needs, both of utilities and customers, as well as the grid in the context of this load growth? So whether it's those time varying rates reflecting temporal variation in costs, increasing fixed charges to reduce that volumetric energy rate, or even rates for specific load growth technologies, or others that you have thought about or might be aware of, we'd be interested to see that. So, and please detail that in the chat. So we'll give a moment here for you all to answer this. And Miles, I assume you'll show that when we have enough responses. Oh, great. Okay. Well, this is interesting. Yeah, I appreciate everybody sharing their thoughts and perspectives on this. Seems like time varying rates fairly overwhelmingly are the kind of sort of preferred, most likely strategy here to balance these different needs. So, but that's great. So with that, let's go to the next slide, which I think is actually my last slide. So these are just kind of some concluding thoughts here about, you know, customer bills and how, you know, what drives customer bills, as I've talked about so far, may have implications for how you design and implement building electrification programs. So yeah, I think it's kind of a no-brainer, you know, buildings that are in locations with low electricity rates, electrification makes a lot of sense. And we tend to see that as well just in practice, you know, in the Southeast that tends to have low electricity rates and our homes with a lot of underlying electric resistance technologies. There's a lot of heat pump deployment, for example. And certainly targeting marketing to customers with those electric resistance technologies can be pretty straightforward because those are the customers who are more likely to experience bill savings and favorable payback times on their investments. But it is those customers with fossil fuel baseline technologies like natural gas heating or water heating that may need some additional education. Or customers without pre-existing space cooling. So when you install a heat pump, you get air conditioning, which is great for comfort, but it also adds a new load for customers, which can be an increase in their bills. And so educating those customers in particular about the potential financial costs, but also the health and comfort benefits of electrification can be, you know, a possible design consideration and implementation consideration. There may also be some additional non-rate incentives necessary to incentivize heat pump adoption, especially among some of those customer populations where the economics are a little bit harder to pencil out. And then really being thoughtful again about, you know, balancing the need or the interest to lower that volumetric energy rate with that incentive to invest in energy efficiency, because as you know, I started all of these slides with, energy efficiency has value to the grid, it has value to customers. And so it's important to maintain that resource, especially as we need to expand this grid to meet all of this load growth in the future. So I think the last slide we have here is some resources. The next one should, yeah, has a sort of a compendium, I think, of what Natalie and I thought of as the greatest hits on this particular topic, and you know, some good places to go for that. But I think we'll end. I'll stop here, see if there's questions or discussion, and certainly if you have some other questions for Natalie, we can do that as well.
Great. Well, I think Natalie has to leave in a couple minutes. So any last quick questions for Natalie? If not, there is a question in the chat. We are experimenting with end use rates, the third option in your poll, Andy, and dynamic flexible load management rates. Do you have any data, resources, or case studies that you can share that are relevant? Anything that springs to mind, or you can add it in the chat box. And Sean's at his most recent report. That's great.
That was I was going to say, yeah, look at Sean's report. I actually, maybe as a plug for the IDSP training that Lisa put in, I have added some additional content around dual fuel heat pump programs. So dual fuel heat pumps use a fossil-based backup like a gas furnace as supplemental heat, especially during like really cold weather for heat pumps, electric heat pumps. Some utilities, so Otter Tail Power, which is in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, as well as I think Vernon Electric, which is a cooperative. They offer they offer a rate discount, an incentive to control your heating load. And so what they can do if you have a dual fuel heat pump system, and so they can actually utilize the fossil backup during grid events, during peak events, to help mitigate those peak impacts, maintain customer comfort, and you get a rate discount. I think it depends on the program, which of the utilities, and but it's something on the order of like 2 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, at least in one of those cases, you have to sub-meter that heating load, and so there are some additional costs and kind of complexities that come with it. But yes, there are some places and utilities out there that have these kind of end-use specific rates. And especially for load management strategies. Lisa, you're on mute.
It's funny because I was saying anyone want to take themselves off mute to ask a question. That was ironic. I have a dog here too, so I've been like using the heavy mute button because she can be really loud. All right, well, as you're thinking of questions, feel free to, raise your hand, take yourself off mute and ask a question or put it in the chat. I have a question for you, Andy. I love that you you started out your career in part as a utility consumer advocate for Indiana. And, I'm looking at slides 33 and 34, where you're talking about the different options for electrification rates, largely time frame rates versus higher fixed charges. If you put your hat back on, so forget that you're a researcher, you're putting your consumer advocate hat back on, although you're really knowledgeable utility consumer advocate. Where do you land with respect to for electrification rates for buildings, right? Which is really different. It's not like, oh, you have an EV, we're going to have an EV rate for you just for the EV. Like this is like whole home, right? And so, so it's a whole home rate. So where do you land with respect to higher fixed charges? And also, with versus time varying, but also would you put on these rates like just people that have high electricity use, like your higher use customers, or does everybody get on these rates? Like, are these rates in a higher electrification future for everybody, even if you still use gas, say for water heating and space heating?
Yeah, boy, that's a really great question, Lisa. Yeah, I mean, I think I lean towards time varying rates for a couple of reasons. One is, this is really about customer bills and the ability to manage customer bills. And if you increase that fixed charge, customers just have less and less of an opportunity to manage their bill. And so as a ratepayer advocate and even as a researcher, I believe and have seen in the data, that customers are capable of managing their bill and they can experience significant bill savings. So it's important, I think, to preserve that piece of it. And then from the grid perspective, I mean, it's, peaks and energy consumption drive costs on the grid. And so I think from that kind of broader like ratepayer benefit perspective, it's all about lowering those costs. And to do that, time varying rates, I think, send the clearest price signal to customers. Don't drive up those peaks. Don't consume when costs are really high. And so there's some benefits there for sure.
I also think you can calibrate them over time as we get better and we get different, it's less like there's a single peak hour of the year that we care about. And it's like, actually, there are now seasonal peaks and actually now we care about more stuff. And so I think that that adds to my interest in time varying rates as at least part of the equation. Does anybody want to take themselves off mute and share what they're doing at their in their state or their, we also have tribal entities, we have utility, public power utilities participating in that. Anybody want to take themselves off mute and offer any perspectives on this? Or you can enter your opinion in chat. People really like the chat box.
Lisa, this is Nate here, and I guess I don't actually have any perspective to offer in this moment, but I did think of another question, which was just, Andy, I'm up in New England, and I was wondering if the data you were showing were all from places where there was high penetration of natural gas, or if you were looking at delivered fuels, and just, I guess the specific question I have on that is, how much do utilities need to be paying attention to this kind of thing if they have really high rates of delivered fuels, or is it really only as relevant in high natural gas areas?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Nate. So specifically in the study, I think our Northeast utility that we were modeling had very high, as I'm sure you're aware, fuel oil, right, and a little bit of some propane in the underlying fuel mix. I think utilities, from the customer perspective, certainly it's customers that have a fossil fuel, whether it is natural gas or fuel oil or propane as the existing technology, underlying kind of baseline technology. I do think the other utilities should also be not concerned, but sort of aware of these issues and that are going to switch from summer to winter peaks, or at least that the winter peaks are going to be now something that is noticeable and needs to be sort of thought from an operational perspective as well. And that is happening outside of places even that have a large amount of fossil-based heating to begin with. And so I think those are kind of the two pieces of it, but certainly the utilities with a lot of fossil fuel baseline technology, these are the ones that I think are going to need to consider the customer education component in program design and implementation for sure, and think through maybe some of like additional programs and incentives beyond just retail rate design. I don't know if rate design will get us far enough to make the economics make sense for a lot of customers there.
Thanks, Andy. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and Nate, after this, I'll put some links in the chat to the dual fuel heat pump rate programs for load flexibility that I found.
Great, thank you. I think I've read the Otter Tail. Is that what it
Yeah.
is? I haven't seen the other one, so that'd be great. Appreciate that.
All right, we have a hand raised from Tamara. Do you want to take yourself off mute?
Yeah, hi. Thank you all for presenting about this. I'm at the Colorado Public Utilities Commission and just wanted to share that the time of use rates has been a really big deal recently, and our commission yesterday was deliberating about this for 2 different utilities and was kind of deciding on the different time of use rate structures moving forward. And I think a lot of the conversation was also about kind of equity and affordability concerns where the utility, the smaller utility with a lot of lower income customers that are struggling, they decided to treat differently than the larger utility because the customers in the smaller one don't have as much ability to shift their load as the rest of the customers. That was kind of their rationale, but wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of the equity component of, customers that have a lot higher usage and more appliances and EVs and that sort of thing have a greater advantage in taking, they can take advantage of time of use rates more than customers who, work all day and have to come home and then run their laundry when the rates are on peak.
Yeah, that boy, we could probably go for hours talking about just kind of this question. There's some good literature out there on low income customer response to time varying rates. I'll put a link to one kind of meta study that we did here at the lab in the chat here shortly. I think it's some of it's very kind of empirical and some of it's very anecdotal as well. I sort of asked the question like, are there technologies that can help customers respond regardless of what their kind of structural situation is, if they're working multiple jobs or, what their tendency to be is at home versus not, what those kinds of patterns are, or what just their home building setup is. I mean, smart thermostats are available, they're inexpensive, you can program them. There are other technologies, Amazon Home or all the Alexa stuff. I mean, there's ways to use some pretty inexpensive technologies to help control usage even during those peak periods. So, but it's a great question. Yeah, not fully settled for sure.
Mar, do you know if electrification for buildings was much of the discussion?
I think that's a piece of it because there is a beneficial electrification. Like the utilities have to be doing beneficial electrification as well.
Right.
And so they found that because of the cold climate, like what was mentioned before with gas prices versus electric prices, when you switch a household to a heat pump, it often raises their bills, which is another equity concern in terms of those customers being left on the gas system.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to share what's happening in their state or their organization? And feel free to chime in on the chat box. There's a question in the chat, Andy. Would that low income meta study include any feedback loops caused by levelized billing? Not sure which study.
Yeah, I don't. Boy, it's been I didn't Some colleagues did the study. I haven't read it in a while. That's a great question. I'll yeah, let me pull the study up. I'll put a link in the chat, and
That'd be great.
might require some detailed dive to see if that's the case.
Yeah, at least folks will have the link. All right, let's move now to our final presenter, Sean Murphy, who's going to talk about load forecasting, and then specifically some of the work he did with a couple of utilities on these electrification impact questions. Sean?
All right, thank you, Lisa, and hello, everyone. Thanks all for being here, and thanks to Natalie and Andy for setting us off. I think the presentation I'll be walking through today is going to build on some of the themes that came up in their presentations, and looking forward to doing some Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. So I'll start things off with a poll. Curious, have you ever used or analyzed a load forecast? There is no wrong answer here. Will the results pop up? There we are. Okay. All right. Pretty evenly split. Well, for those of you who have not, that's okay. I'll give some sort of context for what a load forecast is and why it's useful in utility planning pretty soon. And for those of you who have, hopefully some of this information is new, and you'll be learning some things about how building electrification can factor into long-term load forecasts. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to start with some context, some background on long-term load forecasts, and then provide an overview of this framework that we developed to incorporate building electrification into long-term electricity load forecasts. Then walk through each step in the framework and provide some examples of how we use forecasts that incorporated building electrification to address planning questions for 2 different municipal utilities. Then close with some key takeaways and then move on to the Q&A. Next slide. Utilities develop long-term electricity load forecasts that cover 5 to 20-year periods to form multiple sort of planning concerns, including generation, transmission, distribution, financial planning. Many utility processes, as shown in the figure on the right, operate on shorter timeframes. There are things you need to do on a day, or weekly, or like month-wise basis, but long-term forecasts orient planning towards future system needs as opposed to more immediate ones. Often, utilities estimate peak demand in the future by extrapolating historical trends between peak demand and economic data and weather data out into the future. This approach is pretty common in load forecasts, and it typically produces an estimate of gross peak demand, which is the demand before you account for the impacts of distributed energy resources, DERs, such as rooftop PV. Utilities will then take that sort of foundational forecast and then add or subtract to it based on the expected impacts of behind-the-meter generation or other distributed energy resources. Utilities are increasingly incorporating state and policy goals into their forecasts and accounting for some of the impacts of the building electrification. Next slide. The framework that we developed responds to this interest in building electrification. So for each step in a framework, we provide some guiding questions and identify sort of key modeling decisions and considerations, and provide some examples from technical assistance that we provided to 2 municipal utilities, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, or SMUD, which is in Northern California, and Fort Collins Utilities in Colorado. It's important to note that our approach is not the only way to develop a load forecast that accounts for building electrification. It reflects the lessons learned from our technical assistance and the data that we had available. And it, in particular, focuses on how to use these publicly available end-use load shapes and load forecasts. I'll get into that in a little bit because there's sort of a data resource out there that we leverage for this and can be really useful for your purposes and in any utility that's developing a load forecast that I want to increase your awareness of. Next slide. Our framework includes 7 steps, which you see here. The first few sort of frame the forecast by defining the use case, establishing a scope, and selecting a base year load. That's a term I'll come back to, bears some explanation, but you can sort of think it's that foundational estimate of like what you think load is going to be in the future that you can build your electrification forecast from, or build your forecast from. And next, the framework shows how to choose key inputs on technology selection and adoption before making the actual estimates of the changes in load due to building electrification. And finally, the framework provides examples of how to apply the forecast and actually analyze different planning problems that you might be facing. The next slide. You can move to the next one. I'll now be walking through each of the framework steps and providing some examples. So the first is defining the use case. It's important to ask at the onset what planning activities you're trying to inform, be it generation, transmission, distribution, or financial planning. The decisions made on the forecast scope, and the scenarios, the analyses that you conduct with the forecast are all downstream of this decision on what the use case is. So in the next slide, I'll provide some examples of how we address this with our collaborating utilities. The utilities we provided technical assistance to had some different goals in mind. Fort Collins Utilities was interested in the impacts of building electrification on its distribution system, and in particular, whether their feeders may require some upgrades. If you're adding a lot more load, that can put some strain on the physical distribution system and may require some upgrades. They're also interested in understanding how energy efficiency may be able to mitigate those impacts. SMUD, on the other hand, was interested in the system-wide impacts of building electrification to inform their integrated resource planning process, as well as efficiency program design. So slight differences in the focus here. Fort Collins is more on the distribution system, and SMUD was system-wide, and that had some impacts on the decisions that we made in the next steps of the forecast. Next slide, please. So once a use case is defined, the next step is to establish the scope of the forecast in terms of the physical part of the power system that you're concerned with, the customer segments that are relevant. So that's residential versus commercial and industrial, and then the time frame that you're concerned with. Each of these should be consistent with the use case and sort of be internally consistent. If you're focused on residential feeders, then you don't need to think as much about industrial load growth. As I mentioned earlier, long-term load forecasts can be from 5 to 20 years. The further out in time, the more uncertainty there is, but understanding what might happen in 20 years can be really important for decisions in the near term. The lead time for getting a new substation may be 5 years, so it's useful to know if you're going to need one, say, even in 10. To select a time frame, some things to consider include what policies you're trying to account for, whether there is a requirement to analyze load over a particular time frame due to statutory requirements, and whether you're looking out far enough to see the sort of expected, market-based or policy-based impacts of electrification. So if you're expecting that there's a lot of adoption of EVs in 10 years, your 5-year forecast isn't going to shine a lot of light on the issues or things you're trying to solve. It's helpful to have a time frame that sort of includes the periods in which you think these changes are going to occur. Next slide, please. So for both SMUD and Fort Collins, we set scopes that align with the use cases and sort of internal planning and policy goals for the utilities. So for example, we consider both residential and commercial load for SMUD and developed a 20-year load forecast. So at the end of our forecast aligned with the end date of these policies that were affecting building electrification and transportation electrification actually in SMUD's area. With Fort Collins, since they were interested in the distribution system, we focused on 15 high growth feeders that were largely serving residential customers. And we did a 15-year analysis that'll sort of align with, or so that, because 2040 was the sort of the end year of an analysis they had done related to their system changing between summer and winter peaking. So we were trying to align with some of their internal analyses with our forecast. Next slide. I'd mentioned this term earlier of a base year load. So often utilities are using that regression approach, looking at historical weather, economic and load data, using that to sort of understand how does peak demand depend on the economy and weather, and then extrapolating that into the future. That's a pretty common way to sort of set a foundation for your forecast and then make adjustments from there. We ended up taking a slightly different approach that had to do with the sort of the data that we had access to. And we were really interested in understanding what an hourly load forecast would look like. So we wanted to do just more than just the single hour of peak demand. So what we looked out for was we started with a sort of entire year's worth of load from the utility. We took the meter data from the utility and said that this is the sort of foundation from our forecast, and then built on top of that in terms of adding the electrified loads. Different ways that you could go about that. If you have a single year of load, that's going to carry with it sort of the specific weather, economic, and events that occurred in that year. If you took multiple years of load and averaged them out, things average out a bit. And then you can also have a more kind of metric way of estimating load by taking all these different variables and trying to project a relationship out in time. One of the key inputs here is that we needed access to 15-minute or hourly gross metering data, and also having the PV generation data is really helpful, because sometimes if you just have the net load shape from a utility, you need to add back the PV generation to understand what demand was at the building level. In next slide. So as I mentioned, we had to make some decisions based on sort of the data that we had. And I'll be talking about this database of end-use load profiles. So that's basically, what does an hourly load shape for a heat pump, electric water heater look like? There's a database that we use to provide those for our forecasting. And those were all based in 2018 year. So we actually had to use 2018 load as sort of our foundation when we worked for both SMUD and Fort Collins. And for SMUD, we just aggregated everything by customer class, because we knew there were differences in the technologies between residential commercial customers when it came to electrification. And then for Fort Collins, we sort of aggregated customer level load at the level of 15 different feeders. So we had sort of 15 different load shapes that meant 15 different forecasts, basically. Next slide. So choosing scenarios. Really, in any aspect of utility planning, scenarios are going to help you understand or help you explore a range of possible futures and get a handle on the sort of range of outcomes that could occur from sort of different drivers of uncertainty. You can't explore everything with every possible scenario. Can't understand load forecast under every possible different condition that could happen in the next 20 years. So selecting scenarios is an important step in setting some bounds on like the complexity of your analysis, so that you're making your scenarios around the key things that you think will be affecting building electrification. In particular, you can select scenarios on building electrification related to technology adoption levels. So that's say, what share of homes do you expect to have heat pumps in 2030 versus 2040? And then technology operations, which can include the efficiency of technology. So knowing whether you're putting in an electric resistance water heater or a heat pump water heater can have a big impact on the amount of load that you'd expect in a forecast. So in order to construct these scenarios, you consider different policies that affect building electrification, as well as expected market changes that can affect adoption. So you can relate the scenarios to, say, the end date of a policy, and then work backwards to determine, well, if we comply with this policy and it says everyone has to start buying a heat pump water heater or something by 2035, what does that mean for adoption in the following years? And you can also use policies to inform the sort of efficiency levels as well, because you may realize that the building code sort of informs the minimum level of efficiency. So you can use these as sort of levers and move them around to construct sort of different options to explore in scenarios. Also mention that establishing a baseline scenario is really important, so that you can compare alternative scenarios against them. It's a pretty standard practice in scenario analysis. And next slide, please. So for SMUD and Fort Collins, we developed scenarios that both accounted for the impacts of state and local policies, then also addressed uncertainty in weather and technology adoption, as well as considered multiple levels of efficiency in building electrification, or efficiency of those technologies. In particular, for SMUD, we had this baseline efficiency scenario that reflected sort of current market offerings, high efficiency that reflected the high end of market offerings, and then a minimum efficiency heat pump scenario that sort of modeled the worst case scenario if you had like the least efficient heat pump that sort of reflected what it would be like if you had heating in a really cold day. For Collins, we similarly had this baseline in high efficiency and also explored different levels of technology adoption due to the inherent uncertainty in what adoption would look like. Next slide. So next is the selection of technologies to include in the forecast. You can think about this in sort of two different steps. First is, what are the end uses? So that's like water heating, space heating, cooking that you're concerned that you expect to electrify. And then what are the particular technologies that you'd select? So if you're expecting space and water heating, it's important to include those. But if you're not expecting a lot of people to electrify their dryers, you may not include that in the forecast. When it comes to the actual technology selection, you make decisions, say, between that electric resistance water heater and a heat pump water heater, since those can have pretty significant impacts. Again, you can align these decisions with policies that exist. As I mentioned, building codes may set that minimum efficiency level for you, but you also may need to make some judgment calls on what you expect people to adopt in the future. Example here would be, do you expect people to fully electrify the space heating, even in a cold region, or do you expect them to retain their gas or oil heat in the Northeast, for example, and then have the heat pump just sort of as a supplementary heat source? Those decisions can have a big impact on sort of peak demand estimates and are important things to sort of be explicit about in developing your forecast assumptions. And next slide. So here we take a look at this table summarizes the specific technologies that we selected for our forecast in SMUD and for Collins. I'm not going to go into the technical details of each of them here, but what I wanted to convey is, we considered full electrification, space, water heating, cooking, and clothes drying. And then we made sort of specific technology options or selections that reflected what we thought would be the typical market offerings. And the options that we selected from were somewhat constrained. We couldn't model every potential thing you can buy at Home Depot. We were using this tool called ResStock, which I'll get into a little bit later, that includes these load shapes for different electrification technologies. So there was a pretty good menu of technology options, but didn't include everything. So we selected the ones that we thought were most appropriate from it. The sort of decisions that you can make in selecting these technologies could be that the different SEER or HSPF ratings, which are efficiency metrics for heat pumps, and the different levels of of envelope, or like the location in the building where envelope is installed. All of these things can have an impact on the loads and is sort of the level of granularity that you can get to in developing assumptions on technology selection for load forecasts. And next slide. So the next thing I want to talk about is selecting the level of technology adoption in different years of the forecast. It's really important to first know, what is the level of adoption of the technologies that currently exist? Do you have any heat pumps in your area? And then you can determine what's driving adoption and estimate how it changes over time. So policies and consumer preferences may be the drivers here. You're never going to have perfect foresight for these things, but you can make informed assessments of adoption by considering what adoption is compliant with relevant policies and trying to understand what sort of the market dynamics are and how people are starting to adopt these things. You might be able to leverage some existing estimates of technology adoption. There are researchers who've been making efforts on this. We have some resources at the end of this presentation that link to those. And alternatively, you can try and model tech adoption using different stock turnover or diffusion models. Provide some links there in case you're interested. There are just existing methods for trying to estimate sort of adoption over time that you could leverage in a more bottom-up way that utilities might be using in their forecasts as well. We'll also add that knowing adoption at a sort of utility-wide or state level is useful for a forecast, but we do expect that adoption of electrification technologies to vary geographically. Some people are more likely to adopt than others. Some are more able to adopt these technologies than others. And there are methods to sort of relate the sort of socioeconomic factors of adoption and use those to understand what pockets of a utility's jurisdiction may be more likely to have sort of heat pumps in the short run. Next slide. So this shows us we set building electrification technology adoption in SMUD's territory to comply with some state policy goals, which are pretty, or local policy goals were pretty aggressive, with 100% electrification of space and water heating by 2045. And then in Fort Collins, we used a pre-existing study that they had done that had a few different levels of technology adoption, which we show in the bottom right. And you can see that in the top there's the yellow and blue. There was already a decent amount of cooking and drying electrification. And the big change they expect is that there's more heat pumps coming in, as you see in green. So most of the adoption that we were concerned with was with the heat pumps. And next slide. So far we've covered selecting the technologies and their adoption over time. And now I want to talk about how these two things come together to produce estimates of building electrification. At a high level, you can imagine that you have sort of a load shape for a heat pump, and you want to scale that up, because if you know that everyone in an area is going to adopt them, you can just multiply those two together. But in reality, not all buildings are the same, and not everyone they don't always use technologies at different times and different intensities. So a building electrification forecast that assumes that there's just a single prototypical heat pump or electric dryer isn't really reflecting the variation that we know exists. We address this challenge by using these models called ResStock and ComStock, which are developed by the National Renewable Energy Lab. And they provide end-use load profiles for these representative buildings that are representative of the US building stock, both as they were and what we expect them to be under electrification. The really powerful tools that we've been using across a number of our projects and have been used by utilities in their load forecasts, because they're things you can directly download and incorporate into your processes. There's a lot of details on all of this, and I'm not going to go into all of them. We do have a companion report to all of this for anyone who's interested in the nitty gritty. So for now, I'll move on to the next step. Once you have those, so if you can move to the next slide. Once you have those load profiles, first thing you want to do is just sort of check how close do they align? How well do they represent the demand as we know it? So we took this step of comparing the sort of modeled load from ResStock, which is in orange, to the actual meter demand in SMUD's territory in green, just to get a sense of how well it's representing reality. And what we see is that it's pretty good at representing the demand in the summer, which we see in section 7, and then in other parts of the year, it's not as accurate. So we had to sort of adapt and find a way of utilizing these in a way that didn't carry some of these biases. So if you move to the next slide. The way we approached this was by taking the models, these end-use load profiles for sort of the baseline condition of this is what the buildings in America look like right now, and then what they'll look like once they're electrified, and calculating the difference between them, and then using that difference in the forecast as opposed to just the direct output from modeling. So this is one of the most methodologically dense parts of our project, so I don't want to go into the depths of it, but I'll just say it's important to sort of interrogate the data sources that you're using and understand whether like these things that are modeling building loads are reflecting building load in the areas where you live. And next slide, please. So this is this is the last section of the presentation where we're showing how we applied some of the results of our forecast. And Lisa, could I just get a quick check on how much time we should have left in for this section?
You're okay.
Okay, good. This is the most interesting part, because we're at this point we've made all the methodological decisions about how you build a forecast. Now we actually get to apply it to the planning questions that we're concerned with. So this provides a quick list of some of the analyses that we performed for SMUD and for Collins. It's not an exhaustive list. There's a lot of other things that you could do with a load forecast, but it provides some nice examples of the types of things you can do. So if you move on to the next slide. So in this figure, we show the load shape of the peak day in both the summer and the winter in SMUD's territory for in our electrified future for different 5-year increments in our forecast. So starting with 2025 and moving through 2045, we found the day that had the highest hourly load in both the summer and the winter. And we looked at the whole day just to see what that load shape looks like. And when we do this, we're able to understand a couple of really interesting things. First is we can see how the magnitude of peak demand changes over time with our forecast. Then we can also see how the timing of peak demand changes. So in terms of magnitude, what we see is it's increasing. The peaks are getting larger as we're electrifying loads, which is somewhat what we'd expect. We see that the increases are largest in the winter. They're much larger than they are in the summer, but they're still significant in the summer. I will note that this forecast here included transportation electrification, which is a driver of some of the results. And then when we think about things in terms of timing, we can see that this purple load shape that's on the top in the summer, which is on the bottom on the left-hand side of the figure, is further to the right than that blue load shape, which represents 2025, because the peak is now occurring later in the evening once we've added all of these new loads. And then on the winter, in 2025, our peak is 7 p.m. But in 2035, because we've added all of these heat pumps and they're turning on in the morning when it's cold in February, the peak ends up being in the morning. So there's this big switch in the timing of when a peak happens. And that's really important because you need to make sure that you have enough generation on hand in the future to meet those loads. So knowing the timing and the magnitude of these peak loads affects sort of resource planning. It also affects your planning for your distribution system, because you need to make sure that the wires are able to handle these loads. So using a forecast just to quickly illustrate what peak demand will be in the future and when it occurs can quickly give some insights into a range of planning practices. Next slide, please. So next we take a look at the technologies that are driving increases in peak demand in SMUD's territory in 2045 on the summer and winter peak days. Each of these bars here each color represents a different technology. I'll direct you to the dark blue, which represents heat pumps in residential buildings. They're one of the biggest drivers in winter, as we'd expect, as people largely have gas heat right now in California. So if we electrify everything, it's going to add a lot of load in the winter. And because we have these end-use load profiles, and we did this bottom-up analysis, you're able to understand what technologies are driving the increases in peak demand. And that's important, one of the reasons that's really important is then that tells you these are the places where we have the most opportunity to manage peak demand, such as through energy efficiency or demand flexibility. So this figure indicates to us is there's a lot of opportunity we should be looking to how we can manage heat pump load sort of in winter mornings to manage peak demand in the future. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, Fort Collins Utility is really interested in the impacts of building electrification on its distribution system. And the concern there is that if you have a lot more loads, and so loads are really high and they're staying like that for a long time because you've got people trying to stay warm, that can basically heat up the components of your feeder. Like there's just a risk that some of this infrastructure overheats. So in collaboration with their distribution engineers, we developed this analysis to understand the risks of these thermal overloads. And this figure illustrates one of the key trends. I'll just focus on the top left, which is in the summer with our sort of baseline case. The right hand is showing current, so that's the amount of power flowing through the wires, and then I think the y-axis is number of hours. And what it shows is the higher the current is, the shorter the time period that it's at that. And what we did is we basically took this relation, where we found like how long the current was remaining at different levels and compared that to these like design guides for feeders to determine whether is this going to be at an unsafe level. If the power is at 100 amps for 10 hours, is that a concern? And what we found is that there weren't actual thermal risks to the distribution system in Fort Collins territory, which was good for them because then they have one less thing to worry about. It was a really interesting analysis because we were able to sort of assess the sort of physical risks that the system might face under high levels of building electrification. Next slide. So I think Natalie touched on this a little bit earlier, but one way to manage the impacts of peak demand impacts of building electrification is through energy efficiency. So as I had mentioned, we'd use these baseline and high efficiency scenarios. And when we take the difference between those, as we did for Fort Collins in this figure, we're able to estimate how much higher efficiency electrification can reduce peak demand. You're still going to increase peaks when you add high efficiency electrification, but you'll add less. And what we found is that the biggest drivers of efficiency, rather the biggest sources of reductions, were in heat pumps, which we show in orange here, and then envelope upgrades, which are in purple. And then next slide. So this is the last slide, which I actually think is my favorite and the most interesting of our analyses. So for SMUD, they were interested in how, in let's say 2045, you have 100% adoption of heat pumps. If you have a really cold winter day, everyone's trying to stay warm, are you going to have a big spike in demand? They're concerned about sort of this cold snap impact in the future. Sacramento doesn't get super cold, but the efficiency of heat pumps does decline when temperature decreases. So even if it's 20 degrees outside, the efficiency is less than if it's 65 degrees. So there is this concern that you'd have this large increase in demand. Basically, what we did here was sort of a stress test. We developed a really conservative scenario that isn't something we expect would happen, but at least gives us sort of like the upper end of what could happen, which is if you had heat pumps operating at minimum efficiency. Basically, if you met all of your heat through electric resistance heating. And we were able to do this because we had those end-use load profiles, and they provide us all of this extra data about what the heating needs, and allowed us to do some additional analyses. And our estimate was that there'd be about 85% increase in heat pump load, which is pretty significant during this. Yeah, so pretty significant increase, but it's not so large that it doesn't become significantly larger than the summer peak. So the sort of takeaway was it's unlikely that SMUD would become a winter peaking system, even if it had this extreme cold day, just because the summer peaks were already really high, and the winter peak would have to increase a significant, even more in order to catch up with it. So I have one more slide, just some key takeaways before we can move to Q&A. Long-term electricity load forecasts are foundational to a range or a number of different utility practices. Forecast scenarios can explore uncertainty in building electrification technology and efficiency levels. And utilities can use publicly available end-use load profiles to account for the impacts of building electrification long-term load forecasts. And last, utilities can apply these forecasts to address a number of different planning questions related to electrification, peak demand drivers, understanding feeder thermal overload risk, and the peak demand impacts of extreme weather. Right. And here are some resources that we referenced in the report and also in our companion report, or rather in this presentation and in the main report, if you're interested in finding some useful inputs to your own work.
Great. Thanks, John. Does anybody have any questions? I don't see any in the chat box right at the moment. They were still on the last time varying rates topic, which is great. We'd like to talk about that. Any questions for Sean about the two utility studies that he worked on with respect to electrification and efficiency as well of electrification technologies? Sean, I have a question. Can you tell me what SMUD and Fort Collins utilities did with the results of your studies? How did that help inform, their planning?
That's a good question. I think they were both. Sometimes, we were an external voice in everybody. It provided like an external voice and assessment for more internal conversations, I think, is the sort of connective thread. They both have some, right? SMUD has its own forecasts, and it was helpful to have us come in and provide an independent assessment of what they thought would happen. So I think they compared our results to theirs and used that to as part of their broader decision-making processes or risk assessment processes. As we had last talked to them, we can check in and see if anything else has changed.
And you know, if a utility wanted to do this, or if you know, state agencies wanted to request that a utility do this kind of analysis, what kind of data would the utility have to have in terms of, you know, interval data? You know, how much can you rely on public data sets versus like very specific utility system data?
Great question. So this analysis and our approach was based on the assumption that you have the interval metering data available. It really does open up some doors when you have the hourly data to work with. We use the end use load profiles because it's often that you don't have any metered empirical load shapes. I think if you have on hand access to sort of metered heat pump load from, say, a building electrification program, that could be really valuable. That's great, and either as a supplement or replacement to the load profiles. And the same goes for EV charging. I know some utilities have actually applied metered EV load shapes into their load forecasts. So it could both be an input into itself or a useful check on the modeled load shapes. But I know utilities have been have used these load profiles developed by NREL, and I think they have the capability to more have the capability to use them. And it would be interesting to see them do so.
Yeah, I put a link in the chat to the end use load profiles that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has developed. And there are also reports from Berkeley Lab and NREL on how you can use these end use load profiles for a variety of purposes, not just for the purpose of looking at electricity load growth in this sector. Any questions from anybody? You want to unmute yourselves and ask a question or make a comment about the work that you're doing or the work that the utilities in your state are doing?
Yeah, if I can ask a question of folks, has anyone seen, you know, what level of detail have you seen utilities provide in terms of the building electrification portion of load forecasts?
Well, and our utilities actually, you know, filing this information in proceedings, whether it's integrated resource planning, distribution system plans. You know, we mentioned earlier in Colorado, there are the beneficial electrification plans. In other states like Minnesota that have them, several states. So I'm sure that folks who are participating today, some of the folks have seen these in filings in their state. Anybody want to share? And people really love that chat box. Feel free to put any sources there. Sean's contact information is on the slides that are posted. And I'll repost the link right now just to make sure that everybody has that. But you know, feel free, you should ask us any follow-up questions that you have. We'll be happy to answer questions offline or point you to the resources. We have one new message here. In Vermont, utilities file what they call their Tier 3 plans annually, which report electrification and energy efficiency installations and forecast continued growth.
Vermont's a good example. I think we referenced Vermont's practices in a report on distribution planning and load forecast chapter. So
great. Also, tomorrow's posted in Colorado, recent discussion to align the load forecast used for various plans. So this is a real hot issue across the country. You have, you know, distribution plans, you might have integrated resource plans, you have beneficial electrification plans, you know, what have you. And then you have your load forecast that you're using for revenue requirements to set rates. And they can all be really wildly different. You know, so I think it's really useful also in transmission planning. At some point, you got to wonder why the difference is. And it's interesting to sort of try to explore that. What we've seen is, to the extent that states are working on more integrated planning across different types of plans, we're seeing even restructuring within utilities, where within the utility, there's more crosstalk between the folks who are doing distribution planning and load forecasting for other purposes where there hadn't been before. So I think that's a really useful step. And I think it's really beneficial for the utilities and utility customers. All right. Well, thanks so much, Sean, for your presentation. Thanks for everyone for sticking with us for a pretty long webinar today. I hope it's helpful. There'll be a recording posted shortly at the same website where the slides are posted. And we hope to see you again soon in a future webinar. Also, please, if you're interested in going to the Integrated Distribution System Planning Trainings Live, there's all new material in the 2024-2025 series that started in December in Charlotte, continues in Detroit, March 11th and 12th, in Denver, April 30th and May 1st. And we hope to see you there. Register by March 3rd. Register by March 3rd. And there are some, you can get travel reimbursement if needed, but I think for the most part, DOE fellows do have their travel stipends that they also can use. All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.